Alright, today I want to talk a bit about sword cutting. There will be old cringy footage to illustrate what not to do. And hopefully this will help some people who like backyard cutting, or maybe even occasionally participate in cutting tournaments, or even if it's just for the entertainment, if you just like to look at the stuff or interested in how it's done or not done in this case. And I'll show you the progression over the years. So started all the way back in 2007. So I can claim that I have 10 years of sword cutting experience, which illustrates that if somebody tells you that and is trying to claim authority or expertise, that doesn't really necessarily mean anything. It depends. If somebody trains, practices sword cutting for 10 years, regularly, like say 2 or 3 times a week or even more often under proper instruction, yes, they will be very good after those 10 years. But if you don't know what you're doing for 10 years, like if you do it wrong for 10 years, it doesn't matter how long you do it. You need proper instruction, and you need to figure things out, which can take a long time if you're doing it on your own. So yes, and I didn't do it that often, not that consistently, because throughout those 10 years, Kara and I have been living in rental apartments, and it's always the same problem. Where do you go? You can't just go out in your backyard and do stuff. You have to find a place, and you have to find an opportunity to do it, and etc., etc. Tatami mats are expensive, a wide variety of challenges here, and I think at the best of times, we probably did it 3 times a month, probably, and then there were periods of time where it was several months without anything. So yeah, anyway, let's just get to it. So let's take a look at old, clueless, fat Skull and what he tried to do here. Yeah, there's so many things wrong, I don't even know where to start. So, okay, first off, the foot position, the stance, is facing the wrong direction. Pretty much you can see the way that's aligned, it's kind of pointing off at about 45-degree angle away from the target rather than facing toward the target. And as the cut comes in, there's quite a bit of a lean, and the rear foot lifts off. That's always bad news. If you notice your rear foot is lifting off as you cut, you're doing it wrong. You have to figure out how to fix your body mechanics. And also, this kind of, scooping cut may look neat, but it makes it much harder. Particularly in the beginning, I would not recommend trying anything like that. In the beginning, I would recommend stick to the line that you want to cut. So if you want to cut diagonally, go to the starting position, go just through that line, and that's it. Don't start elsewhere and then come in, because that will twist things and that will make the edge alignment harder. Now, in this case, I was just messing around with this deliberate overswing, but it still serves to illustrate the problem here. Look at how misaligned everything is. So the foot is pointing off in one direction, the knee is collapsing inward, which can cause injuries, and there's kind of almost an S-shaped curve in the body, so it's all twisted and weirdly leaning, and it just doesn't work. So if you're starting out, now you can see that there's this adjustment step necessary at the end, and another one even with the forward facing foot. So in the beginning, I would suggest keep it simple. Start with your right leg forward, square off to the target, and just try to not swing so much with the arms, but try to just keep the arm relatively rigid and powered from the core. Rotate your hips and do it that way. I should make a separate video about some of the details of how to do it at some point. Yeah, not too much to say about this. Is once again floating rear foot, and it's kind of funny how in this still it looks like I'm giving the bottle this astonished look, like, whoa, it really pierced the plastic. Anyway, what else we got? Lots of cringy stuff here. Occasionally I did manage, when taking a step in particular. Whenever you take a step, it's easier to engage the hips, even though at the time I was still mostly swinging with the arms. Things weren't really connected. The ideal cut is one where your body moves as a unit. The arms and the hips and the legs all just kind of move together in sync. Here's another example. Look at, I don't even have to comment on this. This is pretty obvious. The the ankle is just in a very unhealthy position there. This was uneven ground, which doesn't help, but still, I'm collapsing knee here again. Lots of problems. I missed that claymore, but I had no idea how to use it. Like, none. You can see, so issue here is it's done from an ineffective position for one. It's not a proper guard to start with, but it's also, it's this very retracted kind of cut. And this will be a recurring theme. I'll talk about this quite a lot, actually. Yeah, claymore with one hand. I always like to mess around every now and then. Good example of how poor cutting mechanics can lead to a less than satisfying result. I should have been able to cut this piece of tatami easily, but instead, see here, the cut kind of, it looks like it starts almost as a downward diagonal cut and then it turns into a more or less horizontal. It was just very off. This footage is almost too bad to even make many statements about this. You can hardly even see what's going on. Here's another classic example of overswing. So I wasn't really stopping the cut with body structure, but it was just kind of floating out there. It was kind of flying out. And there's also an issue with where you focus the power. If the maximum power is generated past the target, that's too late. The maximum acceleration needs to happen before it actually hits the target. In this case, if it's after, then it gets really hard to decelerate the blade, because now you're past it, now you're trying to stop it, and this is still where it's close to maximum velocity. Another good example of what not to do. So the movement is too inconsistent. If you look at it, it swoops down, then it comes up, and then the cut comes in, and it comes in once again with this really poor arm alignment. Yeah, you see here, the arm is very strongly bent. The wrist is slightly bent, and if you drew a line from the elbow to the end, the top of the hand, this would be more curved rather than straight. And ideally, the entire structure would be straight. The entire arm would be straight. The most powerful and most efficient cut is one that comes from the shoulder, where the entire structure is rigid. And you'll again see this later, because this has always been my number one mistake. These very retracted kind of chicken wing cuts that have a lot of problems. As I said, I'll keep talking about this. So yeah, this is still 2010. And this may not look too terrible at first glance, but it's still the same issue right here. The arm is bent, so that does a number of things. So for one, it's not as sturdy of a structure, it's not as solid. If you hold out a sword and let somebody push against the blade, if your elbow is bent, it will be much easier for them, because then your position is compromised. You can only work against it with your muscles and not at 100% efficiency. Whereas if you hold it straight out, not quite locking your elbow, but just straight arm, hold the sword, have somebody push against it again, you will notice that it's much harder for them to move it, because now you're supporting it with the skeletal structure and everything is more in line. There are other problems as well, like you're reducing the reach. Obviously, if you pull it in like this, you lose quite a bit of reach compared to an extended arm. And there are other problems as well. Here, this was 2011, I think, or 2012, something like that. This is starting to look a little better. There's still problems. You can see here there is, the arms aren't straightened as far as they could or should be, and there's again the rising rear foot, because the legs are still just not pointing in the right direction. So this foot, the right foot, should be further over to the right side, and then it would align a lot better. It's not too terrible. Backhand cuts I've always found easier, so it just makes it harder to mess up, essentially, because everything is nice and in line. You can just essentially extend your arm and just move your torso, just do the core rotation and it'll probably be halfway decent. Here, this is 2014. I tried to make this a bit more dynamic by coming back into a guard, but the edge alignment is just not quite right. There's too much of a scoop here again. So it's better if you want to do it from more of a fluid motion to essentially move into the position, into your proper starting position first, where it will be a line rather than a curve. So you move into that position and then you execute a straight line from that. I mean, it's an arc, obviously, but you imagine the cut as a straight line and then you follow that. So here, I mean, this was a decent cut, at least on the bottle, but there's the weird thing here is the lean. There's really no reason to do this here. Like, there are situations in historical fighting where the lean was advocated for, to get out of the opponent's reach to evade a cut. So if they cut at you, you just lean back just far enough for the blade to miss you, which can be risky. But either way, in this case, there was really no reason to do that. I wasn't even going through a parry or anything. I was just throwing this cut. So this kind of lean is just not effective. I guess this might have been an attempt to power the cut with this kind of torso movement, but you need to power the cut with your legs and your hips rather than the torso or the arms. So again, one of those recurring issues. Yeah, here I try to incorporate some movement that you might do in sparring, but this was just kind of a weird sideways hop. And the other problem is the blade was just connecting with the tip, essentially, just the very end of the blade, which just doesn't have the mass that you need to get through it. And also, if it's a relatively thick target, you need to have at least enough edge to make it through the entire way. So being too far away from the target is another common problem. I see that very often when beginners cut. So if something is not quite right, try to take like a half step closer to the target and make sure that you're actually cutting with the, about a third of the blade, top third. So not that close to the tip. Here, again, the problem is footwork. So you see the legs are pointing, kind of toward the camera rather than toward the target, which means the foot lifts off. You can see rear foot lifts off, needs to adjust, and then the other foot comes around and comes back to a halfway okay stance. So that's quite a common problem. Here's another false edge cut, not as terrible as the earlier false edge cut you saw, but it's still got issues. Even though the wrist position isn't quite as compromised, you can still see that's like a very strongly bent arm. This is not going to work very well. So this needs to be an extended arm, and it needs to be powered with the entire body, not just the arm. What else we got here? Oh yeah, some more terrible footwork. That's a good example of how the footwork can go wrong. Look at the legs here. The foot is passing very close to the other leg. So when they're both this close together, when you kind of swooping inward with the leg as you do the passing step, this loses a lot of stability during the step because it shifts your center of gravity and it does all kinds of bad things. And then it leads to this adjustment being necessary. As you can see, it goes over there. Now the feet are in a straight line, and then the rear foot has to shift back to come back into a proper stance. So, relative to the target. So, yeah. Then here, what do we have? Well, it's still not properly extended arms. I was very much drawing that in. And a lot of people advocate this, you have to draw the cut. No, you really don't. I mean, maybe with a very strongly curved blade. I'm not familiar with how strongly curved blades were used. But with a straight blade, it's not really what you want to do. I can get back to that later. Actually, the point that I want to make right now is, so here I was using a push-pull motion for the cut. So watch the hands here. The hands are completely exposed all the way up to about here. This is where the arms start to straighten out. Before that, when the arms are bent like this, you're presenting your hands. You're leading with the hands. The hands push forward first, and then the tip of the blade follows after. So you don't have the guard to protect you. You don't have the blade to protect you. If somebody in sparring strikes at that time, you're screwed. Your cut is interrupted. Your hands get hit. No good. So that's one of the major problems here. Can look a little bit at cripple cutting here. So this was in 2015, shortly after I had that sparring accident where I injured my knee. And so yeah, of course I can't say anything about the footwork here because there is none. But the problem here is the limp wrist. You see at the end here, this kind of caves in, just kind of flops around and does not return to a proper guard position. So it would, in this case, it would be better to follow through with the wrist being rigid, and as soon as it has reached the top position, this guard, if you now want to switch to a different guard, you can, but not in the middle of the cut. You execute the cut first and then you can adjust. You don't just let it flop limply all over the place. That's the main problem here. However, this wasn't bad, actually. Well, I mean, I wasn't engaging the core. I really couldn't at the time, but just the arm motion itself, not bad. You can see it actually hits in the right place. So the blade connects where it should, and the arm is mostly extended. So this is a far better cut. And the target didn't move that much. So same here. This is definitely much better. Although the wrist, yeah, here, that's the problem though. It's where the wrist, did you hear that? Where the wrist overextends, I did it again. When the wrist overextends like this, that can lead to injury. And my wrists are weird anyway, so this is not good. Okay, so the push-pull. There are several problems with this. I can't cover them all in this video, it would just take too long. I'm just going to point out one thing that leads to a lot of issues, and that is powering the cut with the main hand. So it's better to use the offhand because the offhand is lower on the handle, so more leverage for one, and also you're less likely to do this kind of very retracted chicken wing cut. If you pull with the offhand and squeeze with the bottom fingers, that actually straightens everything out. There are still ways to throw it off, but it's less likely. The push-pull technique, on the other hand, really encourages this kind of retracted position with the bent arms. Now you can train yourself to do that with more extended arms, but either way, since you're now moving both hands, it's less stability than just pulling with one and then using the main hand simply to guide the blade, just to make sure that the edge alignment is correct. So yeah, there's plenty of more factors. I could talk for hours about this, but here's an example of what can happen if you do it this way. So with the push-pull here, the blade enters diagonally first, and then it turns, and then it gets stuck. So you can see the kind of scalloping here. So that's more likely with this sort of grip. Now, it's not to say that you cannot cut properly with this. I mean, this is proof that you can, in fact, cut well with this method as well. It just makes it more difficult, and as said, there is the problem of exposing the hands more. At least the position is not too terrible here. The arms are mostly extended, but you can still see it still looks kind of off. You know, the neck is kind of craned forward, and the body is rotated off to the side a little bit too much. Things like that. So this is 2015, shortly after I joined Blunt Iron, the local HEMA school. And of course, still plenty of problems, but at least you can see the stance is a little better. Now I'm more squared off to the target, and it doesn't move as much. So, oh man, look at that giant ass. Anyway, So here is another common problem. Now, I was taught to power cuts with the hips, but of course it takes quite a while. It takes a lot of time to practice to actually to grasp it, to grok it, if you will. And so this, you can see I'm just kind of throwing the arm out, so there's not that much core engagement going on. I mean, there is a sort of core engagement. There's quite a bit of belly jiggles, but anyway, so let's see. This is also 2015, and this is certainly getting better. You can see there's still the rear foot is still lifting off a little bit, or at least rising. So not great. And there's a bit of a forward lean. Also the wrist is overextended again here. But, you know, at the moment of impact, you see it looks a little bit off. It's not as upright as it should be, but getting better. Not as terrible and completely clueless anymore as it looked before. Yeah, so what else we got? Oh yeah, this is another good example of what not to do. Looks like a decent cut, but the wrist, painful. So you can see right here, this is where the wrist just goes completely floppy noodle, and that's bad. This can cause a lot of injuries. So this is not just a matter of technique, but also wrist and forearm strength. I've personally always had skinny wrists and been struggling with strengthening them. And yeah, if your wrist is not strong enough to actually maintain the rigid structure, because if you're throwing a cut from the shoulder, everything needs to be a completely rigid structure, and it needs to be an extension from your shoulder basically to the tip of the blade. And that way, that's the most efficient cut. And if that doesn't happen, if your wrist gives, and if you when you're trying to stop that momentum, your wrist just kind of gives out and just twists or collapses, that can lead to injuries. So you can wreck either your wrist or your elbow joint, get tendonitis and things like that. Backhand cut is easier. So if you're struggling with that sort of thing, I would suggest trying backhand cuts, because there it's easier to maintain the structure, as long as you tighten your bottom fingers to make sure that it doesn't collapse this way, then it's generally easier. Okay, now here 2016, now we're getting to halfway decent looking stuff. So there's still this, footwork is still a little bit off. You can see there's this adjusting step with the rear foot, but the arm position is pretty decent. So you can see here arms are fully extended, and it does follow the line of the cut, at least to a certain point. Then here is where I kind of draw it in a little bit and over rotate this here as well. So there's again an adjustment step at the very end, but you can see the edge alignment is pretty good. Not 100% perfect, but it's pretty good, and the cut is reasonably clean. So yeah, this is a recurring issue. I'm still working on this. This kind of shifting rear foot has to do with my initial positioning, and also firmly planting the stance. This is one of those details that you just have to practice a lot. But at least I'm not over swinging here. I'm actually just rising up to a high position. It doesn't go all over the place. And yeah, the cut is accordingly pretty good. This is really cutting more from the hips. And yeah, definitely getting a lot better now. This is 2017. Edge alignment isn't great. And here I'm making that mistake again. It's kind of letting it flop in the high position. So there are certain bad habits that creep in again every now and then. So sometimes you have to recheck again. Am I still doing this? This is more recent. This is summer 2017. And this is where we're starting to get into decent, pretty good cutting mechanics. So you can see the arm is all the way extended, not locked out at the elbow, but extended. The wrist isn't. I mean, it's no, it looks okay. I can still be nitpicked. Position on the blade is good, and yeah, not bad. There's still adjusting step there, but getting better. I'm starting to have calves. Yay. Okay, here we've got a pretty decent cut as well, definitely powered from the core, and this is a pretty good cut with one exception. So the footwork here is good. or decent at least. So you can see the foot lands almost at the exact time as the blade connects. That's important to transfer the maximum amount of force. The arms, actually on this one, no, that's okay. So that can always nitpick, but right on this one, that's more noticeable. On this one, the arms are actually a lot more bent. Now, if you're using a strongly curved blade, an argument can be made for a more slicing drawing cut. But the problem is, whenever people say, oh, you need to do a slicing cut, you need to draw it. The problem is, yes, the slice in and of itself is better. So it's better for getting through clothing, for example, or other fibrous material, and then soft tissue as well. But it doesn't penetrate as far. If you actually extend the arms, more of the blade will actually bite into the target and then kind of more follow through and penetrate more deeply. So, but here, yeah, again, you can see the foot is landing almost at the exact same time as the blade connects. It's a tiny bit out of sync, but the body moves much more in unison now. Whereas before it was just kind of flailing the arms out. And here you can see I'm stopping the cut with the body structure rather than just trying to muscle it to a standstill. So you can see here the arms actually connect or contact the torso, and this is in part what prevents the blade from traveling further. So this is a more efficient way to stop it. And yeah, at that point I was also comfortable doing fancier cuts, even though that is quite a bit of a lean here. It's a bit overly dramatic, but anyway, so yeah, that's pretty much it. And then we've got late 2017, so that's where I'm at now, and definitely still room for improvement, but I've come a long way, let's put it like that. Anyway, I hope you found this interesting to watch, and yeah, if you have any other questions, feel free to ask. But I hope this was helpful, and have a good day, folks. Thanks for watching.